Hi, this is Dr. Santos again. We're going to begin Module 1B, Introduction to Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent. So this is, for some of you, going to be material you haven't seen since grade school or high school. For others, you may be well steeped in ancient history, either from biblical studies or just your own interests. The hope here is to give you some new fresh material, a little bit better understanding of what this part of the world look like and why it's important to have an understanding. So the part we're talking about right now is much earlier than the bulk of our study. So we're talking about the time period just after the biblical flood and the Tower of Babel events. So we're moving into the very first, earliest generations of human history after those events, as communities are starting to develop, societies are starting to come into place. We're looking at the post-flood, post-Babel civilizations. And one of those earliest, of course, is that of ancient Mesopotamia. So the oldest Mesopotamia, Babylon, Egypt, Assyria. So we'll be hitting on all those. Not all of today, fortunately. So here's a map of ancient Mesopotamia. Most of you have heard it referred to as this Fertile Crescent. So Mesopotamia is this area right in here. It's described as being between the rivers. So you have the Tigris and the Euphrates. And we know these river names appear in the Old Testament as far back as the Garden of Eden. The post-flood, post-Babel generations had a cultural memory of that pre-flood past. And I think that a pre-flood past is where we get a lot of mythology and traditions. They all had those same stories. Then they bring them in. They get scattered at Babel. And once they go to their own places and their own languages, those mythologies in some ways stay the same. But through the generations, they begin to develop their own flavors as one generation tells the next generation tells the next generation. So, for example, the Babylonian version of the flood story is a little different than, or the creation story is a little different than the creation story and flood accounts from Egypt or someplace else. It's only this little area over here that receives the truth as described in the Bible. And so they uniquely have a different perspective, one of the complete truth. So we're going to see similarities in all mythology as we go through. We're also going to see syncretism. So the Babylonians are going to steal things from Egyptians that they like. When we get to Greece and Rome, we're going to see Greece and Rome take things they like from Babylon, take things they like from Egypt, and they're going to incorporate them and just say, hey, we think they're the same. They just use different names for their gods. And we even see that within Herodotus, who you met in the previous lecture. We'll spend a lot of time with our buddy Herodotus later. So cities of ancient Mesopotamia, we get Uruk, Babylon, Nineveh, Akkad. There's others, but I just wanted to grab a few of these and let you see them. So is South Mesopotamia. It's a Sumerian city. It's massive temple complex dedicated to Nana. Has a few other names. Moon god has some other names as well. Uruk, one of the first city-states associated with Gilgamesh. We're going to talk about Gilgamesh today. Their numbers are about 4000 BC. Babylon, of course, the Tower of Babel, had the Hanging Gardens, which we'll talk about when we get to Babylon specifically. We'll be talking about later Babylon than we're dealing with here. Nineveh becomes capital of Assyria. And we can see both Babylon and Nineveh appear in very early in the book of Genesis because they were created at the same time by the same person. We'll talk about him later. And then Akkad, capital of the Akkadian Empire, and we have Sargon. And I don't think I put any biblical stuff about Sargon yet, but we'll get a chance to talk about Sargon. He's a little later. Early archaeology. Now, in your reading for this week, you have some material on the history of archaeology in general, and specifically biblical archaeology. Just want to mention this one guy. He's one of the most important guys. He's a little bit of a good guy and a little bit of a bad guy, but Heinrich Schliemann, 1822 to 1890. He's primarily known for the excavation at Troy. He's the guy that said he found the city of ancient Troy. Ancient Troy is the city from the Iliad, so it's Greek. And he made important contributions to biblical archaeology. So his work at the site of Hasirlik in Turkey provides early evidence of historical basis for the Homeric epics, which influence the study of biblical history by demonstrating the potential for historical truth in ancient texts. So it's Greece and Egypt and Mesopotamia. People go there and start finding stuff. And they start finding stuff, and they grab their Bibles and they go, we might be able to find historical stuff from the Bible. And this sparks this interest of going to these places and funding people to go dig stuff up. Earliest archaeology was funded strictly by whatever you can find. You could send back someplace and put stuff on the auction block. That's not really how we do archaeology today, but it is how it began. So Mesopotamia, like we said, it's the land between the rivers, lies in the eastern end of the Fertile Crescent, and was subject to frequent invasions. Something I should mention about this Fertile Crescent real quick is you see this is Mesopotamia, this is the Levant. That's why when we talk about forces that come in and attack Israel through much of the Old Testament, this area here, it comes from the north because they come from over here. They swing up and around, come through Damascus and Jordan and work their way down, unless they're coming from Egypt and here, because they're not coming across, marching across the desert. They do not have Lawrence of Arabia with them, so they're not coming through here. Okay? They're coming through the Fertile Crescent, where there's water, where there's food, where there's supplies, and where they can have constant supply lines. So just something to mention. So between rivers, semi-arid, so we kind of have an understanding of their climate. Some of the city-states went on to dominate the surrounding peoples, especially between the 24th century through the 6th century BC. We see Akkad, Sumer, Babylon, Ashur. So Mesopotamian civilization was the first to develop writing about 3200 BC, like we said. So just some of these important items for us to understand. Ancient Mesopotamia's history, it's marked by war and unrest. These city-states often fought. Even by the time we get to Babylonian captivity era, we still see Babylon fighting with the Assyrians. So Babylon, Nineveh, Egypt coming north and doing battle. We'll get to talk about the real historical World War I, which was actually Egypt, Assyria, Israel, and Egypt, Assyria, Israel, Babylon. Those all coming together at one event. So Mesopotamia history summarized. First kings to rule over the large territories were the Akkadians. The descendants of them were the Semitic Amorites, the Akkadian Sargon the Great in 2300 BC. Sumerian supremacy was reestablished by Ur-Nammu. He's like 2100. And all these dates are somewhat relative, and we have to be careful when we're working with them. So just be aware. Don't look at these dates as hard and fast. How I should be describing them is really in terms of their archaeological age, so where they fit within the Bronze Age. But we haven't gone through that yet, so we'll try to match those up later. Important key figure is Hammurabi. You may have heard his name from Babylon. He comes to power in the 18th century BC, and he is credited with having the first law code. And I find it interesting, the overlap with biblical law just tells me that they're getting some things from the same sources. And I would say same God providing the same kinds of laws, and that all humankind should have an understanding of, going back through those cultural memories of interacting with God in the past and knowing him. So some other names, we have the Assyrians, 14th century BC, and a guy named Tiglath-Pileser. He increases the size of the Assyrian Empire. So pretty broad generalization of this long history of Mesopotamia. So one of the big names we're going to run into is Nebuchadnezzar II. Of course, he's in the 600 to 562. He's the guy that led the Babylonians against Egypt and conquered Judah. He took the kingdom from his father, and we'll have lots of time to talk about this portion, the post-Babylonian captivity into the post-Babylonian captivity, important time period for us. We won't spend too much time on it for today. So the Mesopotamian region itself here. So major deities is Anu, that's the sky god, Enlil, the god of air and wind and storm, and a chief deity in Sumer. Enki is the god of wisdom, water, creation, and is often associated with the city of Eridu. And Inanna. So Inanna ends up with another name that I want to throw in here. You can start to see how things get synchronized, because Inanna has a Babylonian name, that's Ishtar. That's the name we should be familiar with. Marduk becomes an important god. He's one of the chief gods in Babylon and Sumer. So we only see one biblical reference to this name specifically, but he has another name in Canaan, and his name in Canaan is Baal. And then we get Asher here, the national god of Assyria. So we see them being polytheistic, as you would certainly expect, all through this ancient era. So we see them building temples, and one of the main temple ideas that they have is the ziggurat. So this idea of a dirt mound. We have these mounds all over the place. You see one there, and you dig it up, and you'll find evidence from the past generally. They had priests and priestesses which performed rituals. They had offerings, sacrifices to appease the gods. And when we look back here and we see Marduk, for example, child sacrifice was one that was practiced. It's interesting. I was just reading an article on ancient Mesopotamia and Marduk, And they love to make these articles and say, oh, those biblical authors, they were just so harsh on ancient pagan religions. They didn't really do that much. Well, if you start to look around, the evidence for it is much, much greater than against it. So we have that. And the more we learn about it, the more we see the biblical narrative being accurate. So we also want to look at the role of kings here. Kings of Mesopotamia often portrayed themselves as chosen by the gods and served as the intermediary between the divine and the people. So you're going to see this in Mesopotamia. You're going to see this in Egypt. The Greeks in the Hellenistic era grab onto this, and through the Hellenistic era bring this to Rome. So we even see Roman emperors, once we leave the Roman Republic and get into the New Testament era of Rome, we see those Roman emperors taking on these same ideas. So, but within this ancient Mesopotamian era, every god is looking at the world in that fashion. And I think they're taking the cultural memory of everyone knew that God was going to send a chosen, and they just started to say, a king's the chosen. And even after the Reformation, you see places like Russia still doing these things, like, for example, in that case, as with the czars. So interesting how these things hang around. So religious festivals and rituals were a central part of Mesopotamian life. These included seasonal festivals and festivals of fertility, festivals for harvest. All these things become important. And that's why they have their multiple gods. Each god has its own responsibility, and it has a responsibility within nature to bring about natural fertility and the natural seasons and bring about the crops. And if you have a year of bad crops, you do more sacrifices to that god in hopes that you would get a better harvest the following year. Mesopotamian religion left a lasting impact on all these other civilizations. 'Cause remember, we're talking post-Babylon. So, of course, those first civilizations after Babylon, they're going to influence everything that comes next. So as they develop religion, they're going to go through this natural process of forgetting the things of the past and making their own man-made gods. So in regards to the afterlife, they believed in an afterlife, but it's generally depicted as a pretty dreary place. You're going to see that as a common theme throughout all of these ancient civilizations as well. Is that none of them are really excited about the afterlife, but you have to have an intercessor to get the best that you can out of the afterlife. So you have this land of no return, living in the shadows, and this continued need for food and water and things to sustain your happiness while in that afterlife. So they really only, in terms of eschatology, they really only develop a personal eschatology of what happens to me when I go to that next place. They're not really, with a few minor exceptions, they're not thinking in terms of prophecy and eschatology of the end of the world and age to come. When these things disappear and what comes next, that just really doesn't happen in this ancient world outside of anything, well, outside of Judah, outside of those people with God who have this expectation, an eschatological expectation. No one else has that. I'll hit some of the minor exceptions and show you why they're an exception, but they're not really, because they don't have that complete development. It's like they went to Judah, they learned a few things, and they picked off a few things they liked, but not the whole system. So Epic of Gilgamesh, the reason it's important is because it has an ancient flood account in it, and it has an ancient creation account. So it deals with a number of things, and people from the world, the historians and archaeologists and people who study ancient history outside of biblical studies, like to point to, like they did with Hammurabi, and say Hammurabi had the first law code, and Israelites must have stolen that law code when they came into Canaan, took over Canaan. They were just a people group. They're pretty nomadic. There was many of those places don't believe there was an actual Exodus. They were just a people group that came to Canaan, took it over, kicked the Canaanites out, started a new religion based on their made-up stories. But they grabbed this Babylonian law code, they grabbed it, and they used it to make their own biblical law code. Well, I see it in reverse from that, in that Hammurabi learned something from them. And like here, there's an ancient flood account, and they say predates the biblical written flood account. And I go, well, probably makes sense to say there was a flood account, and the ancient Israelites got it from God and wrote it down. And this account of Gilgamesh represents the oral tradition of an actual flood that we find in every single culture, ancient society that's sort of civilization that's out there. I think there was a flood. And their accounts have a lot of similarities to ours. There are some differences, and you expect to have those differences. So this ancient Epic of Gilgamesh, it is one of the oldest literary works around that we know of. It originates in Mesopotamia, which is why we're studying it. It's this epic poem that tells the story of a guy named Gilgamesh. He is a semi-divine king of Uruk. And it talks about his adventure. He's not a very good king. So Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, he's introduced, he's powerful, but he's arrogant. He's 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. I'm not sure how that math works out, but that's the account. He has an oppressive rule. Like I said, he's not a good king. So in response to people's plea, the gods create Enkidu. And Enkidu is like, if you took a coin with Gilgamesh on one side, he's the other side of the same coin. So the gods create Enkidu, and he's this wild man. He lives with the animals, and he's eventually tamed and brought to Uruk, where he confronts Gilgamesh, and the two fight. Of course, they have to. Eventually, they become like brothers, and seeking to prove their strength and gain eternal fame, Gilgamesh and Enkidu embark on this adventure. And they go to Cedar Forest. I mean, you don't need to read this full account. And if you do go to read the full account, I'm going to warn you, there's one titled, I think that it's the New Translation of Gilgamesh. And this entire story is quite profane. But the newer version, translation of it, is pornographic. So if you want to read the account, go on YouTube and find the Wishbone version if you want your kids to understand it, or find one that's been tamed and doesn't have more detail than is absolutely necessary. I'm just going to give you that warning. So just be aware of that. So they go out, they're doing battle. They slay the bull of heaven sent by the goddess Ishtar after Gilgamesh rejects her advances. That's where you get the profane part, among other parts as well. The gods, angered by the death of the bull of this, decide that Enkidu must be punished. And Enkidu falls ill. He dies. Gilgamesh is quite unhappy over that. So that's going to lead him to continue on with his adventure. So, stricken with grief and fear of his own mortality, Gilgamesh departs on this quest. And he wants to find that man that survived the Great Flood. And because he survived the Great Flood, he was granted immortality. So he wants to find the secret of immortality. So on his journey, Gilgamesh faces all these different challenges and meets, it's a typical kind of story. He meets lots of different people during this account and finds this tavern keeper who advises him to just embrace life and not continue this quest for immortality. So the ferryman helps him cross the water of death to reach this guy. And I've avoided saying his name because I'll butcher it for you, but Utnapishtim, something to that effect. We'll just call him Ut for this account. So our buddy Ut tells Gilgamesh the story of the Great Flood. So that's where we get the Great Flood account, which bears similarity to the biblical story of Noah. He explains that the gods granted him immortality as this unique gift, that immortality is not meant for mortals. And Ut reveals the existence of a plant that can restore youth, and Gilgamesh retrieves it. However, on his journey, returning to his own land, a serpent steals a plant. Gilgamesh is left with nothing. He should have listened and just embraced life. For its biblical account, no God and be saved. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk, realizes that immortality is beyond his reach. He comes to accept his mortality and understands that his legacy will live on through the great city that he built and the deeds that he accomplished. So that's why we have this impact on literature and everything that comes past. And as you can see, for one of the oldest stories, it's pretty unique. Unique for its day, obviously, in that it's this long epic poem. But the reality is it sets up how many other stories that come after it with the same kind of theme. So another one of these ancient accounts you need to be aware of is the Enuma Elish. The Enuma Elish is an ancient Mesopotamian creation myth. Another one you want to be careful of reading to your kids at bedtime because there's some awfully profane stuff in it as well. Typically, the way the gods create life is there's already something there, the waters or the universe or something, and it's through their tears and other bodily fluids all mixing together that creation happens. So even in their own myths, they can't conceive of the world without nothing. Really, it's only the biblical account that goes that far. And that, like I said, there's some others that kind of sort of get close, but not quite. So we'll see those as we go. One of the oldest known stories dating back to the 2nd millennium BC. Enuma Elish means something like when on high. So it's cosmic chaos. They like this idea of before the creation is as we know it today, there was chaos. So formless. and meaningless. We get into saltwater stuff, and then creation takes place. And there's in this creation, there's chaos that happens, and the chaos brings about inconsistencies, but discontent as well among these gods. So younger gods, noisy and active, and they want to do things. So you can see how they're writing a story about creation, but they're being anthropomorphic about it. They're making it sound like the world that they know, and that's all they can really write about is the world that they know, and that's how the ancient world is. So these other gods decide to kill them to restore peace. Tiamat is reluctant, but Apsu, with the help of the vizier Mumu, he prepares, or Mamu, prepares to carry out his plan. However, A learns of Apsu's intentions and uses his magic to put Apsu to sleep and kills him. A then creates a dwelling on Apsu's body, and from this place, Marduk, who becomes the hero of the epic, is born. We're going to talk about Marduk here in a second. Tiamat's revenge here. Enraged by the death of Apsu, Tiamat creates an army of monsters and appoints Kingu, one of her consorts, as the leader. She gives Kingu the tablets of destinies, which grants him supreme power. So you can see we're gonna get this battle coming up, but we got to learn about who Marduk is. So the rise of Marduk is an important theme here. The younger gods are terrified of Tiamat's power and ask Marduk to be their champion. Marduk agrees on the condition that he'll be made the supreme god after defeating Tiamat. The gods agree, and Marduk prepares for battle. So a couple things about Marduk. Marduk was the chief god of Babylon, and I told you that he has another name that shows up in Canaan, Baal, or Baal, however you want to pronounce it, but it's Baal, that's how it should be. His best known story is here in the Enuma Elish. Marduk's, got ahead of myself there. It's right here. Most significant role is in the Enuma Elish. Selected by the younger gods to battle Tiamat. The embodiment of chaos. That's who Tiamat is. After defeating Tiamat, Marduk creates the world from her body and establishes cosmic order. And then he becomes king of gods. Marduk's primary temple was in Babylon, where he was worshipped alongside his consort, the goddess Sarpanet. City Babylon itself was considered the center of the world in Mesopotamia, after Sumer, of course. So, annual festival, one of the most important religious events in Babylon, which Marduk was supreme over. Renewal of cosmic order. So you needed that every year. So Marduk's legacy continues even after the fall of Babylon. He remained an important deity in the region, and his mythology influenced other cultures and religion in the ancient Near East. Story is a powerful one of the transition from chaos to order. So, like I said, he does have one mention in the Bible. It's mentioned in Jeremiah 50, verse 2. Now, like I said, he's mentioned under that name one time. There's lots of other references to his worship of bringing children to the fire, things like that. And later on, Baal's mentioned lots of times. So be aware of who you're thinking about when the biblical accounts talking about these ancient gods and where they came from. Later, he's known as Baal, which means Lord, or Baal. And we see that name Baal or Baal of something. So same kinds of ideas around that name, being he is the Lord. We already mentioned, we don't need to go through the Enuma Elish in complete detail. We mentioned the details, or the summary, a second ago. He does confront Tiamat. There's this dramatic battle, and using his powers and the winds, Marduk captures Tiamat and slays her by shooting an arrow into her heart. Then he splits her body in half, creates the heavens from one part and the earth from the other. And that becomes the creation of the world, and Marduk establishes order in the universe. He organizes the gods into a pantheon. He gives them these specific roles that we talked about earlier, giving them, limiting their roles, but giving them specific powers over the different jobs they have. He, of course, takes the tablets of destinies, and that solidifies his supreme power. So he does have the one ring, and gave everyone else, while he kept the one ring to rule them all, he gave everyone else rings in which they can be ruled by. All right? So the epic concludes with God's building a magnificent temple for Marduk in Babylon, establishing it as the center of worship. The gods praise Marduk, acknowledging his power and authority over the cosmos. So just again, should have been a picture there, but it's cosmic order versus chaos, divine kingship, and that's how the ancient world looked at. This is what kingship should look like. This is how you bring about order, by defeating your enemies and having one ruler over to rule them all. And how humanity got to this point. So it's not just a creation of myth, but also a reflection on the political and religious ideologies of ancient Mesopotamia, and the centralization of power in Babylon, in Sumer, and the elevation of Marduk as the chief deity. So it tells stories that explain to them how they got to this point and why they're living the way they are. So, a few quick points. Mesopotamia, divination and omens. Mesopotamia believed that gods communicated with humans through omens and signs. Priests known as Baru practiced divination to interpret these signs, which could include the reading of animal entrails, dreams, or celestial events. Of course, when we get to the book of Daniel, we see them still interpreting dreams, but we see the ancient world doing more than that and looking for signs in all of creation. In any kind of chaos, anything that's out of the norm becomes a sign. So, lunar eclipse, solar eclipse, comets, meteor showers could all be divined in different ways by these religious leaders. And really, they could do anything they wanted with them. So, a widely publicized archaeological discovery was the Royal Cemetery at Ur. It was excavated in the late 1920s. This is one guy, Woolley. You'll see him in your summary of archaeology study. So, this extensive burial ground included grave gifts of gold, silver, imported alabaster, lapis lazuli, which is like a blue gemstone, very popular in Egypt, So all these are in the graves. So some graves were constructed with multiple chambers. So these larger burials contained a wealth of exotic goods to comfort the dead in the afterlife. So they had musical instruments, and there was chariots and jewelry, ritual slaughtered humans attended. There's many questions around this stuff. The interpretation's not totally solid, but those are the things they're seeing and how some of it's being interpreted as well. So there's few details of eschatological beliefs that survive from this region. The Ugaritic story includes that at death, the spirit goes out from the nose like wind or smoke. It seems that in Mesopotamia, death was considered the final, and the afterlife dismal and empty. So Ugaritic texts refer to the netherworld. We'll see that as a continued theme. It's muddy, it's putrid, it's desolate, it's ruled by Mot. And so it's just not a great place. We look forward to our afterlife, and they did not. Funerary ritual text from Ugaritic king calls for the deceased kings to join the Rape-Uma. That's a cognate from Hebrew, which is, if we do a study on that word there, it's used in Isaiah to describe the kings, the foolish kings who had died in the past and now lived in something like they're describing here. But foolishness, his idea of dying in your foolish ways, even though you didn't have to. So, Mesopotamian eschatology, we're discussing Babylonian myths, explains the ritual as designed the orderly cosmos, but has nothing to say of eschatology. Thus, we're brought back to the conclusion that only notion of really eschatology, there's nothing about the future when things end. The only place where that exists is in Israel. So this quote here, I think, is good. There's no evidence in Babylonian thought of any eschatology. Eschatology, according to the dictionary, is concerned with last or final things. So there is no resurrection or final judgment or any kind of apocalyptic predictions. Now, they did have prophecy, but in their view, all prophecy had to deal with things that were coming in their day. So there's no short prophecy and then long distance prophecy. Those things just don't exist there. There's no idea of what we see in Revelation of the Greek word apocalypsis, or revelation, or unveiling or uncovering of something that's far out in terms of time frame. Of course, we do. We have an understanding of the last days. These are the last days, but there is a day of judgment. There's the day of the Lord. There's a resurrection of the dead. So, biblical understanding of these things is vastly different than what the ancient world did. Now, you're going to hear people say, in many ways, ancient Israelites looked more like their Canaanite neighbors, more like their pagan neighbors than they didn't. They do. They have a lot in common with them. They're living in the same world, dealing with the same problems. But many of their ideas that come from their understanding of Scripture set them apart in a lot of different ways. And one of those key ways was definitely eschatology, And if you want to understand what the ancient Israelites knew about the resurrection, just go and study the resurrection of the dead in the book of Job, and how secure Job was in being able to say, my God will not leave me in the grave, and yet he will resurrect me. He will bring me back. Meanwhile, back in Babylon, the people were buried with things like we saw. They had a belief in the same type of afterlife that the Egyptians did. They looked forward to one in which people could be as rich and powerful after death as they were in life. So if you're a pharaoh or an emperor, it was going to be okay because you're going to go to the afterlife with your stuff. Everyone else went to it with very little. Later legends did not make it out to be a pleasant place, as we've mentioned a couple times. So here's my contact information. Hope you've enjoyed the lecture in this week's class. As always, let me know how I can be of any assistance. And I hope your study of the past will continue to form your understanding of the present, of the Bible, and how special of a time that we live in, living in this dispensation of grace, where we have the canon and we know Christ as part of the body of Christ and as the bride of Christ. And may God bless your studies. See you next week.